The Grand Archive of the Galactic Council stretched across 17 orbital platforms. Each platform contained the collected wisdom of 1,000 civilizations. Yet on this particular morning, every scholar in the social recovery wing had gathered around a single holographic display. They watched footage that everything they understood about intelligent species. Senior archivist of the collective stood at the center of the gathering. His four eyes blinked in sequence as he processed what the human delegation had shared. The footage showed two elderly men embracing on a stage. One had been a prisoner. The other had been his torturer. They were crying together. "This cannot be authentic," whispered Scholar Al, her crystalline form vibrating with disbelief. "No species forgives those who cause them suffering. It violates every survival instinct encoded in biological matter." The human ambassador, Dr. Sarah, smiled gently. She had expected this reaction. Every alien species reacted the same way when they first learned about human reconciliation processes. The concept seemed impossible to them. To most intelligent species in the galaxy, those who harmed you remained enemies forever. Grudges passed down through countless generations. Wars lasted because neither side could imagine any other way. "Perhaps I should explain the context," Doctor offered. She activated her own holographic display. "This footage comes from something we called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. It was established after the end of a system of racial oppression called apartheid." The aliens leaned closer. Their confusion deepened as Doctor explained the history. She told them about decades of systematic cruelty. She described families torn apart, lives destroyed, and an entire population treated as less than human by their own government. The scholars nodded at this part. They understood oppression. Every civilization had experienced it. What they could not understand came next. Doctor explained how the oppressed population, once they gained power, chose not to seek revenge. Instead, they created a process where victims and perpetrators could sit together. The perpetrators would confess their crimes publicly. The victims would listen. Sometimes they would forgive. Sometimes they would simply acknowledge the truth. Either way, both parties would walk away with a chance to heal. "But why?" asked. His voice carried genuine bewilderment. "Your people had suffered tremendous harm. You had every right to demand punishment. You had the power to deliver it. Why would you choose this path instead?" Doctor thought carefully before answering. This was the question that always came up. It was also the hardest to explain to non-humans. "Because we discovered something through our long and violent history," she said. "Revenge feels satisfying in the moment, but it creates new wounds. Those wounds create new desires for revenge. The cycle never ends unless someone chooses to break it." She showed them more examples. She presented footage from Rwanda, where neighbors had slaughtered neighbors in a genocide. Decades later, survivors and perpetrators lived side by side again. They shared meals. Their children played together. Special courts called had allowed communities to process their trauma collectively. The aliens watched in stunned silence as a woman served tea to the man who had killed her family. She explained to the camera that she had chosen to forgive him not for his sake, but for her own. Carrying hatred had been destroying her from within. Releasing it had set her free. Scholar Al's crystalline form had stopped vibrating. She stood perfectly still, something her species only did when processing overwhelming information. "We have studied your kind for 3 centuries," she finally said. "We knew you were unusual. Your capacity for violence exceeded most species. Your wars were legendary in their destruction. But this," she gestured at the holographic display, "this is something we have never encountered." Doctor nodded. "Humans contain contradictions. We are capable of terrible cruelty, but we are also capable of tremendous compassion. Often these capacities exist within the same individual." She advanced her presentation to show examples from Europe. The continent had torn itself apart in 2 massive wars during a single century. Millions had died. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Yet within decades, former enemies had built one of the strongest alliances in human history. French and German children attended schools together. They learned each other's languages. They grew up viewing each other as neighbors rather than threats. Your species rebuilt its most war-torn region into a zone of peace, asked, after wars of that magnitude. We did more than that, Doctor replied. We created shared institutions. We opened borders. We built a common identity that transcended the hatreds of the past. She showed them the memorial sites. She explained how humans preserved the locations of their worst atrocities not to fuel hatred but to ensure remembrance. Future generations would understand what had happened. They would carry that knowledge as a warning, not as a grudge. The scholars began to murmur among themselves. Doctor could not understand their languages, but she recognized the tone. It was the sound of fundamental assumptions being questioned. A younger scholar named X pushed forward. His species, had been at war with their neighboring civilization for over 40,000 years. Neither side remembered the original cause. Neither side could imagine any alternative. Doctor, he said hesitantly, would you be willing to share your reconciliation methodologies with other species? The room went silent. This was an unprecedented request. The Galactic Council operated on a strict principle of non-interference. Each species handled its own internal affairs. For one species to seek guidance from another on something so fundamental was virtually unheard of. Doctor felt the weight of the moment. She understood what X was really asking. He wanted to know if there was a way to end his people's eternal war. We would be honored to share what we have learned, she said carefully. But I must warn you that our methods may not work for every species. They require something difficult. What is that? They require the willingness to see your enemy as a fellow being. They require acknowledging that those who harmed you are capable of change. They require accepting that justice and peace sometimes pull in different directions, and choosing peace anyway. Raised two of his hands. Among my people, though, we have a saying. It translates roughly as blood demands blood. This principle has guided our conflict resolution for 12 million years. You are telling me that humans found a better way. Doctor shook her head. Not better, just different, and we did not find it easily. Our history is filled with failed attempts at reconciliation, with cycles of violence that seemed endless, with hatreds that lasted centuries, but we kept trying. We kept believing that there had to be another way. She showed them footage from Colombia, where former enemies in a civil war had laid down their weapons and entered politics instead. She showed them Northern Ireland, where religious factions that had killed each other for generations had agreed to share power. She showed them Japan and the United States, enemies in a terrible war, now close allies who had built something new together. The pattern is not perfect, Doctor admitted. These regions still struggle with their histories. Old wounds reopen, progress reverses, but the overall direction is toward healing rather than endless conflict. Scholar Al spoke again. Her voice had changed. It carried something Doctor had never heard from a non-human before. It sounded almost like hope. Among my people, she said, we have a conflict that began in our pre-era. Two factions on our destroyed each other for 10,000 years before we finally separated them on different planets. They have not spoken since. The hatred is so deep that even sharing the same star system causes tension. She paused, her crystalline form flickering with internal light. I always believed this was inevitable. I believed that some wounds could never heal. But you humans have shown me that species can choose differently, that the past does not have to determine the future. Doctor felt tears forming in her eyes. This was why she had joined the diplomatic corps, not to make treaties or negotiate trade agreements, but to share the hard-won wisdom of her species with others who needed it. We humans have a phrase, she said. We say that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, But we also understand something else. Those who cannot move beyond history are trapped by it. The challenge is to remember without being imprisoned by our memories. The meeting continued for many more hours. The scholars asked countless questions. They wanted to understand the psychology of forgiveness. They wanted to learn the practical steps involved in reconciliation processes. They wanted case studies, data, and analysis. Doctor provided everything she could. She shared academic research on trauma recovery. She explained the role of ritual and ceremony in marking transitions from conflict to peace. She described how truth-telling processes created space for healing that punishment alone could never achieve. By the end of the day, something remarkable had happened. Representatives from 17 different species had requested formal exchanges with human reconciliation experts. Several had already begun discussing how they might adapt human methods to their own contexts. As Doctor prepared to leave, approached her privately. "I must confess something," he said quietly. "When humans first joined the Galactic Council, many of us were concerned. Your species was so violent, so unpredictable. We wondered if you would bring your conflicts to the stars and destabilize everything we had built." Doctor nodded. She had heard this concern before. "But now I understand something," continued. "Your violence was never the whole story. It was simply the more visible half. The other half, your capacity for healing and reconciliation, was always there too. And perhaps that capacity is exactly what this galaxy needs." He bowed in the formal manner of his people. "Thank you, Doctor, on behalf of the collective, and speaking personally as well. Thank you for showing us that another way is possible." Doctor returned the bow. As she walked back to her ship, she thought about all the humans throughout history who had chosen reconciliation over revenge. The leaders who had risked everything for peace. The ordinary people who had extended hands of friendship to former enemies. The survivors who had found the strength to forgive. None of them had known that their choices would one day inspire entire civilizations among the stars. None of them had imagined that human healing historians would become among the most sought-after experts in the galaxy. But their legacy lived on in ways they could never have dreamed. The galaxy was vast and ancient. It contained species that had traveled between stars when humans still lived in caves. Yet somehow, through all that time and across all those civilizations, no one had discovered what humans had learned through their painful history. That enemies could become friends, that wounds could heal, that the cycle of violence could be broken by those brave enough to try. Humanity had many gifts to offer the galaxy: technology and art and music and science. But perhaps their greatest gift was simply this: the knowledge that it was possible to move beyond the past and build something better together. The stars waited, and for the first time in galactic history, many of them dared to hope.